The former chief of staff of the French Army's General Lecointre has announced a military recolonization of Africa by France and Europe in the next 10 years. This statement has caused widespread concern and controversy, with many people expressing their opposition to the idea of European countries once again exerting their influence and control over African nations. The announcement comes at a time when there is already significant unrest and instability in many parts of Africa, particularly in the Sahel region. Some experts argue that the withdrawal of French troops from the Sahel could fuel neo-colonial fantasies and pave the way for further military interventions by European powers. General Lecointre does not beat around the bush. The withdrawal from the Sahel is a failure for France, Europe, and Africa. He affirms that Europe must defend its interests on the African continent and be capable of taking charge of its destiny on a military level. General Lecointre's arguments in favor of military intervention in the Sahel region are nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to justify France's desire to regain its influence over the region by force. His claims of destruction of government and state apparatuses, civil war in many countries, and difficulties linked to developments in climate are simplistic and lack nuance. Furthermore, his assertions about the demographic explosion of the African continent and its supposed consequences for Europe are unfounded and misleading. It is clear that General Lecointre is attempting to mask his true motivations behind these flimsy arguments. Rather than addressing the root causes of the conflicts in the Sahel, he is advocating for a military solution that would only lead to further violence and instability in the region. The following video contains a statement made by General Lecointre pertaining to the proposed military recolonization of Africa. The video is in French, however. A translated version is provided for clarity. What is our common destiny as Europeans is the Mediterranean and Africa, where our destiny is at stake. And so we, the French, have constantly tried to train the Europeans in this awareness of the need to act collectively in Africa and the Mediterranean. And I am absolutely sorry to see the failure of our commitments to the Sahel. And I think that in any case we will have to ask ourselves the question, because we cannot imagine having at our doors an entire continent that is plunging into the destruction of government and state apparatus, plunging into a form of civil war chaos in many countries and more countries, in difficulties that are linked to climate change, which are even more dramatic on vulnerable populations, such as African populations. In addition, a continent that is going to experience a demographic explosion like no other continent has ever experienced. And so imagine that this is happening here in the next 10 to 20 years, and that it will have no consequences on Europe, because we live in a kind of bubble protected by, I don't know what else. It is simply unconscious. And so I think that this common interest should one day make Europe decide to act as a political entity that will defend its own interests, including by means of the commitment of its armies. The withdrawal of the Sahel was difficult to accept for all those who were involved. I am the first to have a lot of trouble swallowing that. It is a French, European, and African failure, which mainly stems from what we have not understood, which is that the action should be a global action. The restoration of the state, the return of the administrations, the return of development. And if we cannot do all this simultaneously and in a coordinated way, we will fail. That's what happened. What I have trouble swallowing is when I am told that it is the failure of a military operation. The reality is that it is not the failure of a military operation. The military operation was a dimension. I am convinced that in a few years, I don't know if it is 10 years or less or more, we will have the obligation to return and help these African countries. It is not China, Russia, and Wagner who will bring sustainable solutions to the very great difficulties that these African countries and their populations know. So from this video, if these remarks reflect a real intention, they deserve not only critical attention, but also a formal response from truly independent and sovereign African leaders. These claims, if proven true, could be seen as a threat to the sovereignty and self-determination of African nations. It is imperative that African politicians, uninfluenced by foreign powers, take a stand and even consider filing a formal complaint. It is a question of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of each African nation. Well, throughout history, most African nations were colonized by European powers, leading to the exploitation of their natural and human resources and the suppression of their cultures and identities. Over half a century ago, most of these nations gained formal independence, but the legacy of colonialism still persists. What many people don't know is that in former French and Portuguese colonies, France was able to retain a significant degree of control over the economics and politics through a neocolonial system known as La Francafrique. Under this system, France has maintained its economic and political dominance over 23 African nations through various means, including the use of the CFA franc currency, the management of natural resources, and one-sided commercial contracts that siphon off much of the economic surplus generated by these nations. Additionally, France has effectively installed puppet governments in many African countries, stifling dissent and suppressing opposition. Despite this, dissent against French domination of Africa has occurred at various times during the long period of Francafrique and has intensified significantly in recent years. Several governments in West Africa are now openly rebelling against France, and diasporan communities and influential individuals are increasingly speaking out to support and interpret this dissent. The recent exposé of French atrocities in Africa has caused a stir in the international community. It has brought to light the long-standing and heinous policy of France in Africa that has been concealed for years. The unapologetic rejection of France in Mali, Guinea, and Niger by the patriotic new young military rulers of these countries has added fuel to the fire. As a result, France's days of reckoning in Africa, especially in its former colonies, seem to have arrived. The country is no longer at ease in Africa, and its policies are now being scrutinized more than ever before. The situation in Africa is now becoming increasingly tense, and France's heinous policy in Africa is finally unraveling. During the 1960s, French President de Gaulle granted paper independence to French colonies in Africa and formed an alliance called the French Community. However, this alliance was formed in a way that installed puppet leaders in these so-called independent countries who were more focused on French interests than their own. These leaders were essentially French individuals in black skin who fully embraced French culture, and they failed to prioritize the needs of their own countries. Following their independence, the leaders of former French colonies in Africa were given terms that were excessively harsh and punitive. The foreign exchange earnings of these countries were required to be domiciled in Paris, where they were linked to the French franc. This meant that these countries could only withdraw their legitimate earnings with the permission of the French government. Furthermore, it is widely known that all former French colonies in Africa are still paying colonial tax to France. This tax is supposedly for the money that France claimed to have used for infrastructural development in the colonies. However, this seems unfair, as the people in these colonies already paid taxes during the oppressive French colonial regime. This colonial tax is still being paid to France to this day, and its current amount is a staggering $500 billion. To ensure compliance with the terms of independence, the French kept paratroopers stationed in these former colonies at the time of independence. The purpose of these troops was to oust any recalcitrant leaders who were not willing to adhere to the stringent terms imposed upon them by France. It is notable that the policy of France in Africa is beginning to crumble. Young Africans in the former French colonies are actively resisting the stifling grip of French neocolonialism. As of July this year, 8 former French colonies in Africa will no longer use the CFA currency. Instead, they will adopt their own independent currency named ECO, which will be tied to the euro rather than the French franc. This development is a welcome change, as it gives more autonomy to these countries and helps to break away from the legacy of colonialism. However, it is disappointing that the youthful French president, Emmanuel Macron, has failed to recognize the shift in attitudes towards French policy in Africa. Instead of working towards a new approach that is based on collaboration and mutual respect between equal partners, he continues to pursue the same imperialistic policies of the de Gaulle era, which are outdated and oppressive. It is important to note that this approach is no longer acceptable to the leaders of French former colonies in Africa, who are seeking more autonomy and self-determination. In response to the recent development, Macron made a haughty claim that Niger and other Sahel countries would crumble without French assistance. However, France's policy towards its former colonies is a complete mockery of the French values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The country has failed to extend these values to its former colonies in Africa, leading many people to consider France as an adversary rather than an ally. In any case, I would appreciate your insights on this matter. If you find this content valuable, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing it with others. Furthermore, please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for your time and participation.